Thank you so much. And thank you so much for organizing and running such an amazing event. This has been like the most delighted I've been about participating in something, bringing together my love of philosophy and my love of D&D. Just so I've given a little background because I'm going to use a little bit more of the philosophical gumph that I think Jodie did an amazing job of circumventing. Apologies, I haven't done that quite so well. So I'm a philosopher at Cardiff University, and my background, like Jodie actually, is in, and others on the call, is in phenomenology. So I'm interested in lived experience, and particular in the context of mental health and psychopathology. And I'm also interested particularly in kind of the social or interpersonal dimensions of various disorders. So that's where kind of this set of like vague thoughts that I'm shoving together have kind of come together from. So I'm going to start with a perception check about which is meant to motivate a few thoughts and reflections on certain mental health disorders. So in the field in which I work, in phenomenological psychopathology, there's increasing attention looking at how people with various mental health disorders, normally I would scare quote that because I'm uncertain about how we think about disorders and pathologies, but so please just read scare quotes all the way through. But thinking about how people with certain disorders and psychopathologies experience the world. And being a philosopher, I thought it would be fun. Maybe there should be a scare quote around fun to start with a quote from Wittgenstein. He says that the world of those who are happy is different from those who are not. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that all people with mental health disorders or psychopathologies aren't happy, but I'm interested in the idea that even though we might share objective worlds with other people, there's a sense in which we might fail to share worlds with others. And this is a theme that phenomenological psychopathology is increasingly picking up on. So those working in this field are really interested in drawing attention to kind of like the bodily, affective, and also social experiences of those with so-called psychopathological disorders. And a real theme that's been, it's been here throughout sort of the course of psychopathological discussions, but I think it's becoming particularly to the fore in recent years, is attention being drawn to how various disorders might be described as kind of shaping, changing, or even actually disrupting our interpersonal experiences, our experiences with others, or our social experiences. So I'm going to give some examples of this in a moment, but we often find descriptions of individuals who describe either losing or lacking kind of a felt sense of being in a shared world with other people. Now, sort of tying this with the Wittgenstein quote I started with, what's being picked up here is it's not saying that individuals with certain mental health disorders literally live in a different objective world. Like we do share a material reality with one another in kind of this objective third person sense. But what's being picked up here is that the experience of the world is one that is like richly shared with other people in various worlds, in various ways, is sometimes experienced as being disrupted or even sort of rendered or rent, or even lost entirely, depending on the particular individual's experience. So this is a theme that we actually find across a lot of psychopathologies. I'm only going to pick up 3 here, but I think others have been mentioned today already in earlier talks, and we could expand it outwards. But I just wanted to pick up on these 3 as sort of maybe shining a light on different ways individuals might experience kind of a disruption to being in a shared world with others. So the first is schizophrenia. So both clinicians and sort of more theoretical thinkers have drawn attention to the way that lots of individuals with schizophrenia often report feeling kind of a loss of affective connectedness with others, so a sense of maybe togetherness or belonging or resonance with other people. Carl Jaspers and others also talk about often there being a disrupted sense of a shared reality. So often we take it for granted that when I walk into a room with other people, that everything in that room is something that's perceptually available for everyone else there. And sometimes individuals with schizophrenia both lose a sense of whether certain objects are real or not, or experience certain parts of the world as being real for them or available for them, but not available for others. And Minkowski also points to the way that schizophrenia can also manifest as a disruption in sort of the ease or fluidity of social interactions, and attributes this to kind of an experienced difficulty with picking up and acting on and understanding kind of implicit social rules and norms that kind of embed and underlie many of our social interactions with one another. In depression, we also find descriptions of kind of losing this shared world with others. So Matthew Ratcliffe talks about the way that often depressed individuals experience what he describes as a disrupted sense of sharing interpersonal possibilities with others. So while depressed individuals might see that other people are interacting with one another in the world in certain ways, they often report feeling unable to involve themselves in these same ways, finding those possibilities something that they can take up or find properly meaningful. We also find, and this is from David Karp's memoir of his own depression, as well as reports of other depressed individuals, that we get lots of descriptions about depressed individuals who feel that other people just cannot understand them and their experiences. So this profound sense of not being recognized or not being understood by others, which also works as a way to dissolve a sense of connection with others. We also get descriptions of people feeling kind of cut off and unmoved by the world. And I've written about the idea that we, in depression, what can be kind of inhibited or ruptured in some ways is the idea of actually richly experiencing things with other people as a we. And what I mean by this is that we often distinguish between doing something kind of simultaneously or in parallel with one another, such as me happening to walk down the street at the same time as a stranger is doing that, and me going for a walk together with another person. So say if I go with my sister, that I feel like we are going on a walk together. And depressed individuals seem to report the idea that although they are often doing things in parallel with one another, this richer sense of sharing experiences with others can be disrupted. We also find similar descriptions in addiction. So Shane Glacken and Tom Roberts and Joel Krieger have talked about the fact that often in addiction, addicted individuals seem to live in a different world of meaning than other people. So salient features of the environment might be different for an addicted individual than a non-addicted individual. And so we get a lot of descriptions about how for an addicted individual, either certain interpersonal meanings have dropped away, or worlds become dominated by things that are salient around addictive behavior or addicted substances that non-addicted people wouldn't sort of be drawn to or really understand. So again, we get this kind of world where the subjective meaning of the world seems to be very different to other people. So what I'm interested in doing is thinking about whether role-playing games, and I'm going to think about just D&D because that's close to my experience here, might sort of be a way that we could maybe re-find common ground or shared worlds with other people when this sense of sharing or togetherness is disrupted in the, again, scare quotes, like in the real world. So I'm actually referring to the two Ian's recent paper as well here, which I really enjoyed reading, where they gave a really lovely summary of various sort of positive things that playing D&D can be used for. So they point to the way that D&D can be used as a really healthy way and an interesting way to experiment with identity, which also picks up a lot of what Jodie was saying, that D&D can be used as a form of emotion regulation, and also picking up on another theme that Fred also talked about is that D&D can be used as a way to kind of build resilience or confidence. So there's at least some evidence that D&D can do all these kind of rich things for us. And as I said, what I would like to explore, and this is a very sort of exploratory, speculative starting point, is whether playing something like D&D can help us find or re-find shared worlds together. So now we're going to do a history check. Like, based on what's been said before, does this seem like a promising starting point for a project? I give you a heads up and say, not really, at least if we take it from a phenomenological perspective. So one might be concerned that if individuals are already experiencing difficulty in experiencing, again, like the real world as a space that's full of kind of intersubjectively shared meanings and possibilities and values, wouldn't we suppose that things become even more tricky when it comes to engaging with others via kind of imagined worlds? So, I mean, just intuitively, you might think, well, if people are already struggling to sort of find meaning and value that's shared with other people in the actual world that we can grasp and take hold of, how is introducing a layer of something that seems very elusive and difficult to pin down, like how on earth is that going to help us? And this is borne out in some of the discussions, at least in the phenomenology of imagination, because they sort of point to the idea that imagination seems to be a really private affair, and it's through imagination what we have access to, or what we might create, are personal worlds. So the idea is that if I imagine, for instance, a unicorn, while I might be directed at this kind of imagined object, it's in my head, you cannot see it, and neither, it doesn't have kind of positionality in shared space or shared time in any kind of concrete or robust way. So we might think of it as extremely personal and private. We also might add to this, and maybe we'll touch upon this again at the end in terms of kind of the ethical concerns of a project such as this, is we might also be worried that if we're pushing people towards more personal and private worlds that others don't have access to, that this is just going to provide a route for kind of escapism that's ultimately going to lead people further away from having a shared world with others. So we might not only think that my proposition that it could be a tool for finding a shared world is not only sort of ill-motivated, but it might even be damaging or problematic. Why I've called this kind of the history check is appealing to Edmund Husserl, who is kind of like the daddy of phenomenology. When he's talking about imagination, he says very clearly that it makes no sense, for instance, to ask whether the Gretel of one fairy tale and the Gretel of another are the same Gretel. So he's talking about the idea, when I imagine Gretel and my sister imagines Gretel, we can't even have a sensible conversation about whether we've imagined the same thing here. So again, this might drive this idea that there's no sharing here at all. And John Brough repeats this in his discussion of Husserl's account of imagination, where he says that my centaur is mine and the other's centaur is his. Even if they are perfectly alike, they are not individually the same. So even if we have imagined them as having the same features, we cannot bring them together because they're not real objects. They fail to coalesce into something shared. But I think we should insight check some of these kind of previous ideas about imagination. And I think this is because maybe focusing on what sort of the properties that an imagined object might have, or talking about that in terms of its imagined contents might in fact be misleading. Because what it overlooks is, yes, when I imagine a dragon and you imagine a dragon, I might have imagined kind of a blue one and you've imagined a red one. But I think even though kind of those properties of what that dragons are may be different, there is still a sense that we are collectively sort of directed towards an imagined dragon in a specific context, doing a specific thing. And this seems particularly to be worth highlighting when we're talking about sort of an activity such as Dungeons and Dragons or role-playing more generally. Where when we're engaged in an ongoing process of imagination, where we might want to preserve the idea that we're still attending to and are directed at the same imagined worlds, even if they can't be described as being perfectly identical in the way that we happen to represent them. But even if we sort of pursue the idea that maybe it is worthwhile talking about sort of a collective imagined practice, couldn't we still worry about the idea that, you know, even if we can share imagination or imagined worlds in some ways, this isn't actually going to help us in a mental health context, because we still might rub up against the same kind of problems as in the real world. So we still might be worried that even if we're in a process of kind of imagining a shared, you know, dungeon crawl together, that there could still be a kind of a loss of attunement to that world and one another, that even if we're imagining something, the people involved might still not really share the same meaning. The world might not mean the same thing to people, and might still be these kind of loss of shared norms or values, all this loss of shared possibilities. So we might be worried that even if we were generous, philosophically generous enough to allow that, okay, we're going to take collective imagination as something that is practically possible, do we not just like push the problems that we sort of raised at the beginning about losing this sense of sharing with others? Don't we just push that into this imagined world? Like, how does imagination, how does getting involved in D&D activities in particular help us? And what I want to finish by is just outlining 3 potential reasons why I think we don't just kind of delay the problem or push the problem or project the problem into the imagined world, but the actual act of playing D&D, the act of imagining something together, might be doing something importantly different, to kind of echo what Jodie said. So the first thing I want to raise is that I think something specific is going on when we're doing something like engaging in D&D, because we're not just directed at a world, we're not just directed at an imagined object, such as when I said, can you just imagine a unicorn for me? We are importantly co-creating the world together. So what we don't have here is just an example where we're expecting people to be kind of attuned to a pre-given thing. It's not like the imagined world just exists out there and we're throwing someone in there saying, try and find meaning, try and find possibilities, try and find resonance with this world, because we're actively creating it together. And I think this is important because when we typically go around kind of sharing the real world, we often don't make explicit the fact that I, you know, see everything in my kitchen, for instance, right now as available to other people, that I see, you know, the things in my kitchen is available for making food as not just something that I could do, but if my neighbor came around, that she could come and do it together. And all these things that suggest these kind of shared possibilities and meanings, I often take these for granted. Whereas when we are creating an imagined world together, we have to talk about it. We have to spell things out. And I think we're doing something really interesting here in the creation of a world together. Because what we do is we thematize and make explicit the common ground that we're trying to share, rather than just taking it for granted as shared, as I think we often do in our day-to-day lives. I also think there's something to be said for the fact that it is itself a shared activity. So I pointed to depression as often something that's experienced as where we can't do things together, whereas the very act of this is something that we are doing with other people, and the act itself might be something that brings us to feel a sense of togetherness with others. Second, I think that it brings to the foreground how we might act and how we might find that world salient in various ways. So what do I mean by this? Well, often when we're engaged in imagining and creating a world together, we're explicitly stating what we as characters and what NPCs are doing. We explain what our actions are. We often explain why they are meaningful. We even sometimes explain why we think the particular actions are important. So we don't take these things as something that other people can just understand without explanation, because we are imagining them, because we have to give linguistic form to them. We bring that to the surface. So I think there's some ways in which, although we might think about imagined worlds as pared back as less rich than the real world in some senses, what's salient, what we want people to pay attention to is really drawn to the foreground, which might be very helpful if that's something you're finding difficult. And then finally, and just to finish it off, We might also point to the way that if people are struggling to understand shared values, shared meanings, or shared norms about how to act in certain situations, that something like Dungeons and Dragons, at least in some contexts, provides very explicit and formalized rules and norms. So we don't have to rely on something that's implicit. We can appeal to these explicit structures, whether they're the Dungeon Master's Guide or things that we've agreed as a group. And I'm just going to finish very quickly with kind of my big bads, so my worries here. So I hope that this sounds like an interesting path to pursue, but the things that I think that we need to then think about is, this might be all very well and good, but like the very activity of playing D&D together is already a social activity that is grounded in the real world, that involves being kind of sensitive to and attuned to other people. And we must find the activity of playing D&D meaningful in the first place. So I think there's still a question about how do we get playing D&D off the ground in a way that might lead to what I think of as beneficial. And again, this was something that I think Matthew talked about as well, is that are we worried about playing with the boundaries of the real and the fictional when people are precisely struggling in certain circumstances to differentiate between these things? And then I basically, Jodie and I did lots of similar things. I finished with some pictures of some of my own D&D characters, but thank you very much.